Well, good to be with you all, brothers and sisters in Christ. It's been a few years since last time I came to San Francisco. I never remember, it was cold, and now it's really cold. I came from Singapore, 33 degrees, and suddenly I felt quite cold in San Francisco. But it's good to be here, the warm fellowship. Now, tonight I want to share with you this topic, and actually, if you look up the website, it's already on there. It's journeying with the new generation to follow Jesus. And as Pastor Jonathan shared, we have a project, a movie project, which Jenny will share with you a bit later. But you may be wondering, why are we doing this project? And it's because we really want to journey with the new generation. Now, many of you might have a favorite Bible verse, and or a few Bible verses, and one of my favorites is from Acts 13:36. When Paul was preaching, he quoted the Old Testament, David. He said, when David had served God's purpose in his generation, he fell asleep. And I particularly like the phrase, serve God's purpose in his generation. And I pray that in every generation, God will raise up servants of God to serve his purpose. And for us here, I pray that all of you sitting here will not only serve God's purpose in our generation, but also journey with the next generation that to help them also to serve God in their generation as well. Now, of course, I work with a mission organization called OMF, formerly called the China Inland Mission, started 160 years ago. 160 years ago, missionaries went to China. The context was very different from today. So as we talk about following Jesus, what worked in the past is different from what's working now. We face new challenges, new contexts, new situations. But the mission is not changed. And God's mission to us, as Jesus told us, the gospel of the kingdom will be preached to the whole world. The gospel is to reach to the ends of the earth. And 160 years ago, more than 1,000 missionaries from England, from U.S., joined the China Inland Mission, went to China. Today, the call is the same. Even though the context is different, the gospel is to reach the world, an unchanging mission. So, in the year 1929, one of the CIM, or China Inland Mission missionaries, wrote a song called Facing a Task Unfinished. I don't know whether any of you heard this song. It's a very, very nice song. And recently, Getty Music rewrote this song, adding a new chorus. And actually, this song was written by a bishop who joined the CIM in 1929. He wrote this song, Facing a Task Unfinished. And I like particularly the first two stanzas, the first two verses. Facing a task unfinished that drives us to our knees, a need that undiminished rebuilds our slothful ease. And we who rejoice to know thee, renew before thy throne the solemn pledge we owe thee to go and make thee known. I particularly like the first line, that drives us to our knees. Facing the task unfinished, the gospel that reached to the ends of the world. Now, at that time, the reason why the song was written was CIM was praying for 200 new workers to go to the far western part of China. People thought you're crazy. You know that in the 1920s, there was the anti-Christian movement. Missionaries were attacked, killed, and a lot of mission organizations were withdrawing their missionaries from China, going home. And CIM, not only they did not retreat, but they asked the churches back home in England, in the U.S., to pray for 200 workers. People thought CIM was crazy to ask for more workers. And yet when they prayed, God really blessed them. And within 3 years, God not only gave them 200 workers, God gave them 203 workers. Within 3 years, to go into the far western part of China. And that was the story. Now, of course, in those days, we faced a challenge, but today we face a same challenge because we know that billions have not yet heard the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, this chart you see is the latest research from the Lausanne movement. This was published just a few months ago. This is this year, latest. Well, end of last year, they published this figure. They say, where are the unreached people? Who are the people who have not heard the gospel? Now, you know that in the past 100 years, mission work has been in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And Africa, you know that, is now the largest Christian continent in the world. In the past 100 years, many Africans have become Christians. The green part, or the yellow part, is the part of Asia where people have not heard the gospel. The change compared to 100 years ago is different. Today, one of the largest unreached peoples lies in Asia today. You can see here, the chart here. But of course, we talk about the challenge of the unreached, but also there's a bigger challenge. And the bigger challenge is this, that in those days, we need people to go and to bring the gospel to them. But today it's the same. We need the new generation also to bring the gospel to them. But many of the new generations, they are seeking God's purpose in their lives, or they need help to seek purpose in their lives. So, today I want to share with you a story of a young man seeking to serve God's purpose. This young man is interesting. And many people thought Hudson Taylor, the spiritual giant, who changed, the situation in China, brought the gospel to the Chinese people. But a very ordinary person called by God to extraordinary mission. I like the phrase in James chapter 5. You remember James chapter 5, talk about Elijah. Now, many people like Elijah, particularly the Jews, they like Elijah. Elijah was a hero in the Old Testament. He fought against 450 false prophets on Mount Carmel. You remember the story, 1 King chapter 18. But you know that in 1 King chapter 19, Elijah went into deep depression, you remember. He ran away. He was afraid. And then James commented on Elijah. He said, Elijah was a man just like us. He had his ups, he had his downs. And in many ways, Hudson Taylor was like that. And when Hudson Taylor first went to China, exactly 170 years ago, March this year, exactly 170 years ago, Hudson Taylor arrived in China at the age of 21. A 21-year-old man went to China for the first time. He went through all the struggles like any other new missionary. So when I saw his life, I thought, well, that's a kind of a passion for the impossible. A young man, 21 years old, I don't know, what would a 21-year-old from San Francisco like to do? They like to travel around the world maybe. But in those days, Hudson Taylor, when he went to China, it was not easy. Now, a professor from Yale University, Professor La Tourette, a professor in history, particularly researching on Chinese history, this was his comment on Hudson Taylor. Now, this is a professor from Yale University. He said, Hudson Taylor was a man always sick. He's a frail man. And also not particularly intelligent. That's a very interesting comment from a historian. Not intelligent, always sick, but one thing that makes him stand out was that there is one task he devoted his life to. He did one thing, and his whole life was to that one thing, was to bring the gospel to the inlands of China. Now, when Hudson Taylor went to China for the first time, he wrote in his diary, he said, for the first time, I began to understand John chapter 3. Because he said, God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son. What does that mean? He said, when I say goodbye to my mother at Liverpool, at the pier there, saying goodbye, he did not know whether he would come home and be able to see his mother again. Because many people, when they went to China, they died in China. Actually, before 1860, 40% of those who went to China passed away within 5 years, particularly the women. They don't survive in China. Maybe they get ill, malaria, illnesses, accidents, whatever. And Hudson Taylor's mother, when she said goodbye to her son, she also did not realize, would he be able to see her son again? And that's not easy. And that was the risk. And I thought about this concept of taking risks for God. And Hudson Taylor at that time, going to China, was taking much risk. And in the Bible, in Romans 16, Paul commented on this couple, Aquila and Priscilla. And in the Chinese translation, it's very, very interesting. 也为我的命将自己的景象拒之都外. And in English translation is they risk their lives for me. They risk their neck for me. The original word is neck. So here we see Hudson Taylor also willing to take risks for God. So today I want to comment on 5 aspects of Hudson Taylor. What have we learned from this young man? 21-year-old, he went to China, as a young guy. And there are 5 things I want to comment on. One is his passion for lost souls, his passion for the spiritual lost. Now, when he arrived in China, of course, the first port was Shanghai. This was the old map of Shanghai. Now, you can see here on the map, there's a little circle, a kind of circular square at the bottom. You can see that. That was the old Shanghai wall, the city wall. Were there churches there? Yes, there were churches. If you can see the map, the words are too small. All the churches were within the 4 walls. They were churches, but they don't get out. They were preaching gospel to themselves, so to speak. So when Hudson Taylor, this young man, arrived in China, he was shocked. He said, how come all the churches were within the old city wall? The gospel never went out to all the Chinese, let alone going out to the inland. He was so burdened. He said, we have the gospel, and we are keeping the gospel to ourselves. And so that's why he wrote a letter to his sister. And this famous quotation came about. He said, if I had 1,000 pounds, China should have it. If I have 1,000 lives, China should have them. Now, many Chinese churches quoted this phrase, and that's it. No, actually, that was not the end of his letter. The end of the letter was, no, not China, but Christ. Can we do too much for him? You see, Hudson Taylor's passion was not just about China. He was so concerned about people knowing Christ. All he wants to do was to honor Christ. Say, no, not China, but Christ. And so when he went back to England, at that time he was in China for 7 years already. And nowadays we talk about short-term mission for a few weeks, few months. No. Hudson Taylor's first short-term mission was seven years. He was there. He was sick. And people say, you need to go home because otherwise you will die in China. So he was so sick, he headed back to England. And then, when he was trying to recuperate, he wrote this book called China's Spiritual Needs and Claim. He wanted to encourage people to pray for China and be able to go to China. At the end of the book, the back cover, there was this phrase both in Chinese and English. It says, come over and help us. Now, inside the book, that's what he described about China. He said, well, China at that time has 360 million people. And it's a lot of people. He said, if you add up all the people in Europe, it's less than all the people in China. And he described it in a very pictorial way. He said, if the Chinese people were to hold hands together, they would circle the earth 10 times. I thought to myself, well, Hudson Taylor was a doctor only. He's not a geologist. So I asked a professor or somebody with a PhD in geology, I said, can you check whether Hudson Taylor's calculation is correct? So this guy went to the backboard and did some calculation. He said, yeah, he's about right. Yeah. I was so amazed Hudson Taylor sort of did it right. The maths was correct. China, when they were hold hands together, the people, they could circle the earth 10 times. And yet, daily mortality rate, 33,000 at that time. Now, what impressed me from the book was not the statistics of how many people in each province. But Hudson Taylor challenged the people in England at that time. He said, whenever you pray the Lord's Prayer, and today is the same, when we pray the Lord's Prayer, we say, Lord, your will be done, your kingdom come. Hudson Taylor said, you must pray something more than that. You must ask God What is it, Lord, you want me to do so that your will be done, your kingdom come? The Old English is here. What wilt thou have me to do, that thy kingdom may be hallowed, thy name may be hallowed, thy kingdom come? And Hudson Taylor really challenged the people. And then in 1865, in England, he established the China Inland Mission. Not much money, just with 10 pounds. He went to the bank and started a China Inland Mission with the heart, the burden to bring the gospel to the inlands of China. Now, what have I learned from Hudson Taylor is this. Hudson Taylor really was not satisfied with the status quo. Were there churches in China? Yes, there were churches in China. But the churches were not bringing the gospel to people within China, let alone those in the inland. So he was not satisfied with the status quo. People asked him, you formed the China Inland Mission. You're not rich. Hudson Taylor had no, financial backing from anyone. He was unknown. He's a young guy. And people say, well, what happens if you send people to China and there's no money? What happens if the income, is not enough? Hudson Taylor replied, we can afford to wait until he does. I'm sure God's work done in God's way will not lack God's supply. This became one of the most famous quotations by Hudson Taylor. God's work done in God's way will not lack God's supply. And the first group, thank you. Sure. Thanks very much. The first group of missionaries, 18 of them went to China, what they call the Lemmermuir party. They went in a boat called Lemmermuir, and they went together, 18 of them. And now, note that was 1866. Note what happened 30 years later. They started with 18, with 0. First group, 18. After 30 years, at that time, CIM had 816 missionaries in over 100 gospel stations. God gave the growth. He started with nothing. 10 pounds, 18 people, the first group, and within 30 years, the mission grew to 800 missionaries in over 100 gospel stations in many of the provinces. And how did that work? Because the second conviction that Hudson Taylor had was a prayerful dependence on God. And that's why I've shared with you this phrase already. God's work done in God's way will not lack God's supply. This was always Hudson Taylor's belief. Now, how did Hudson Taylor, get this conviction? What happened? He started off not because he started with the China Inland Mission, but because when he was a medical student, he had, experienced God's provision in wonderful ways. Now, he was in London receiving medical training, and of course, when he was in London, he attended a church there, local church. And one Sunday service, after the church service, there was a gentleman, a very poor man, who came to Hudson Taylor and said, Mr. Taylor, can you come to my home and pray for my wife? My wife is very ill, and I need someone to pray for her, otherwise she will die. And Hudson Taylor was very surprised and said, well, I'm not a pastor. You should ask the pastor to go into your home and pray. He said, no, I don't have even money to pay for the pastor. I have no money to pay you. Come and pray for my wife. So he did. He went to his home, and the wife was there, very ill, children around the bed. And he prayed exactly what I said earlier on, the Lord's Prayer. And he said, your will be done, your kingdom come. And as he prayed, he felt as if God challenged him and say, Hudson Taylor, you are a hypocrite. Why do you pray this prayer, your will be done, your kingdom come, while you have this coin, the silver coin, in your pocket? That is a coin called half crown. And he argued with God in his heart. He said, Lord, this is the coin. This is the only money I have for next week, for all the expenses I need to, I need to pay for food, whatever. I have no other money. And Lord say, give this money, give this coin to this poor man. In his diary, he wrote this in his diary. He said, that night when I walked home, my heart was as light as my pocket. My heart was as light as my pocket because there's no more money. The next day, Monday, knock at the door, about 10 o'clock. The postman came. He was very surprised because normally the postman wouldn't come on Monday morning. And he said, Mr. Taylor, there's a letter for you. He opened up the letter. There was no writing of any kind. A blank white sheet of paper. When they opened it up, out came this coin, what we call half sovereign. Half sovereign is 4 times the value of half crown. And he was so deeply moved by God. God paid him back within 1 day, 4 times the value. And that's why the phrase, God's work done in God's way will never let God supply. And so when he formed the China Inner Mission, he strongly believed that God will provide. And that's why the 2 phrases became the motto of the China Inner Mission. Jehovah Jireh and Ebenezer. Jehovah Jireh came from Genesis chapter 22. Abraham offering Isaac. God is our provider. As God provided the ram. And 1 Samuel chapter 7, it means that, thus far, God is our help. Jehovah Jireh, God our provider, and Ebenezer, God is our help, became the motto of the China Inner Mission. Now, as I said before, he trusted in God's provision, so he has this policy of what he called the no solicitation policy, meaning, you don't openly ask for money. You pray and for God's provision. So there was this story. One time he was invited by Moody. And some of you have visited Chicago before, Moody Bible College. Moody. Now, Moody invited Hudson Taylor and said, come and encourage young people. So in 1888, Hudson Taylor went to Chicago and spoke. And so he gave this passionate speech, challenged young people. Very, very good talk. And then Hudson Taylor finished the talk. He came down, and Moody came up to the stage. And Moody said, now is the time. Now you heard a good talk. Everyone, take out your wallet. Now is the time to give money to the China Inner Mission. Hudson Taylor didn't like it. He came back to the stage and stopped Moody and said, no collection. Return all the money. No collection tonight. You go home and pray how God will move you, and then you give to the China Inner Mission. 1 week later, a gentleman wrote a letter to Hudson Taylor and said, well, I was sitting there 7 days ago listening to your talk. I had $50 initially, and I wanted to give to the CIM, but you say you didn't collect money, so I put the $50 back into my pocket. That night when I went home, the Lord challenged me. He said, you are not a poor man. You should give more. So here you are, a check of $500 for the China Inner Mission. So that was the story of the no solicitation policy. And that's why Hudson Taylor said this. Do not worry about having missionaries but no money. But rather, worry if you have the money but no missionaries. And that's a real challenge. So Hudson Taylor believed in the prayer. Initially, he prayed for 18 in the 9 provinces. God provided the 18 workers. And after that, he prayed for 70, and God provided 70 workers. And after that, he prayed for 100 workers. And God indeed provided the 100 workers for the China Inner Mission. You see all the pictures there, the 100 workers for the China Inner Mission. And he challenged the people. He said, well, with the need so great, how can we ask for less? Now, of course, many of you knew some of the workers of the China Inner Mission missionaries. One of them, which stood out, was George Stott. Now, George Stott was a very interesting character because he applied to the CIM 3 times, and they did not accept him. He failed the interview. They said, go home, I don't think you should go to China. Second time, he failed. Third time, he failed. And then after the third time, he actually appealed. He said, can you give me one more chance? Let me meet with Hudson Taylor myself, and I will beg him to allow me to go to China. So in the end, he said, okay, I'll allow you to go and meet up with Hudson Taylor. So he did. And when Hudson Taylor saw him, he said the same thing. He said, brother, you should stay back in England and not go to China. You say, why? Because when he walked into the room, people noticed that he only had one leg. One leg. And, why one leg? And because when he was young, when he was 14, his leg got infected and the doctor has to amputate his left leg. People thought, how can you go to China with one leg? No one could survive in China easily, let alone you have one leg, you can't go. And this is what Hudson Taylor, George Stott sort of asked Hudson Taylor. He said, there are many people with two legs in England, but they are not going to China. Can you please allow me with one leg to go to China? And Hudson Taylor was so moved. He said, okay, I'll let you go. He was sent, you know where? You can see on the chart, Wenzhou. Wenzhou at that time had no church and very few believers. 160 years later, today's Wenzhou, I know many people, Wenzhou people are in everywhere. I'm sure that there are Wenzhou people in San Francisco as well. Today's Wenzhou has 7 million people. 10% of the Wenzhou people are Christians today. I think when George Stott went to Wenzhou 160 years ago, he never could have imagined that 160 years later, God so blessed the church in Wenzhou. It's one of the thriving churches in China today in Wenzhou. And here you are, a person who was sort of deemed to be disqualified, yet God qualifies him. And of course, there were other people as well, the Cambridge 7, the famous Cambridge 7. So, the third point I want to share with you about Hudson Taylor is his innovative methods, because he insisted on incarnational ministry. Incarnational. What does that mean? He wanted the missionaries to wear Chinese clothes, to eat Chinese food, and live in Chinese houses, to let go of the kind of the British way and live like the Chinese. Not only that, they were to learn not only the Chinese Bible, but you know what? They have to learn the Confucius Analects, 论语. I don't think nowadays today, even the Chinese today, learn 论语. And, the teachings of Mengzi. And it's not easy. And they traveled from England to China. The journey was about 6 months. And on this boat journey, every day, the missionaries, before they arrive in China, they have to start learning the Chinese language. You can see the discipline. Every morning, 9:30, start language learning, afternoon language learning. Serious about language learning. And also, incarnational lifestyle. Now, just now you saw the Cambridge 7, all of them wear nice clothes. He was one of the Cambridge 7 hosts. I like this picture. Eating with the Chinese. The background, very rugged. Now, this guy called host, from a very wealthy family, very wealthy, came to live in China. When he arrived in China, he was 25 years old. When he left China, he was 85 years old. Hear me again. He arrived in China when he was 25. He left China, 85. 60 years in China. That was the commitment we're talking about. And of course, in those days, Hudson Taylor was willing to send single missionaries as well, single women. And Hudson Taylor was criticized as the most irresponsible leaders in those days, because you cannot send single women to inlands of China. It's very dangerous. And Hudson Taylor was willing to do that. And he was heavily criticized. Not only that, this group. You can see who were sent. They were not just all from the universities, not all Cambridge 7. They were the stonemason, carpenters, silversmith, blacksmith, all kinds of lay people. It was a lay people movement. That's why the church criticized Hudson Taylor and said, you send some of the most unqualified people to China. And Hudson Taylor was willing to send some of these people, normal lay people, to China. And now, if you see number 3 here, number 4 here, the distinctives, was that the CIM was not trying to establish the CIM church. No. Hudson Taylor was keen to establish the church that belongs to the Chinese. That's why the indigenized churches are self-governing, self-supporting, and self-propagating principles. 三字. Actually, long before 51, there's already the 三字. 原则, the principles were there. Let me move on. Now, one of the things that Hudson Taylor that really encouraged you was his friendship with the Chinese people. You know, when he does mission work, when he did mission work, and you know, he had developed friendship with some very key Chinese leaders. One of them was by the name of Wang Lai-quan. That's on my left-hand side. Now, Wang Lai-quan was a young pastor, but a very capable pastor from Hangzhou. And Wang Lai-quan really encouraged Hudson Taylor, particularly when Hudson Taylor went through tough times. 3 of Hudson Taylor's children passed away in China, buried in China. 3 of them, young. And Wang Lai-quan, particularly when Grace, she died at the age of 6 in China, and Wang Lai-quan, as a local pastor, helped Hudson Taylor, journey with him in the most difficult times. You know, there was this record. They went out together to buy the coffin, came back with the coffin, prepared the body, put it in, and arranged a very simple memorial service for Grace. And that's not easy. And yet, Hudson Taylor had this deep friendship with the local Chinese. Finally, Hudson Taylor, you know, the preeminence of Christ preaching a holistic gospel. Now, you know that in those days when Hudson Taylor was in China, it was also during the period of what we call the Opium Wars. You know, China lost 2 Opium Wars and signing of the unequal treaty. You all know the story. And Hudson Taylor openly criticized the British government. And this is what he said. He said, "We feel that England is morally responsible for every ounce of opium produced in China. And it makes the Christian faith hollow and insincere." Can you imagine? He himself, a British, criticizing the British government, say, the fact that you sold opium to China, that is wrong. It makes our Christian faith hollow and insincere. And so Hudson Taylor was concerned about social justice. And of course, not just that, but you can see CIM established many hospitals as well. The China Animation Medical Work, you can see here different types of hospitals in Lu'an, in Gansu. One of the famous hospitals was in Gansu province among the Muslims. And of course, in the 70s, CIM was also involved in the famine relief as well. In the 70s, you know that in that few years during the famine, just in Shanxi province alone, 1.5 million people died from famine. You know, a severe famine in China at that time. And CIM was involved in helping with the famine relief. Now, was it easy? Not easy at all. There is the cost of commitment, because Hudson Taylor's first wife died at the age of 33. Can you imagine today's, well, if your wife died at the age of 33, that's really, really hard. And yet, his wife died at the age of 33. Not only that, you can see that this is the tombstone. On the tombstone, you can see here, 4 children died, and 3 of them buried in China. Dai Chun and Jane Dieter, that's Grace Dieter, and then Jane Dieter, Sam Dieter, and Taylor, and also Noel Taylor. All 3 of them buried in China. 2 in Zhangjiang, 1 in Hangzhou, buried in China. Children buried in China. Wife buried in China. That was not easy. And yet, for Hudson Taylor's whole life, it's very obvious that he wanted to serve God, the preeminence of Christ. And so that's why this famous quotation from Hudson Taylor: "If Jesus is not Lord of all, he is not Lord at all." I like this phrase. If Jesus is not Lord of all, he is not Lord at all. And so here we are. Yes, is physically he's quite frail and weak, always sick, not strong, and not particularly intelligent, a very ordinary person, and yet called by God to extraordinary mission. And like James chapter 5, it says, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, or Elijah was a man just like us. So, yes, he may be weak, he may not be intelligent, but yet a strong passion for the lost, a prayerful dependence on God. He was willing to be innovative, to be incarnational, and yet deep friendship with the local people, and also preaching the whole gospel as well. And so I want to finish by going back to the very first book he wrote when he established the CIM, was this book, China's Spiritual Needs and Claim, the challenge to people at that time, and I think that in the same way the challenge to me today, to us today. Lord, what will thou have me to do that thy name be hallowed, thy kingdom come, and thy will be done? Don't just pray the Lord's Prayer, but you must ask as you pray the Lord's Prayer, what is it that you want me to do for you? And so this is actually a slide for us all. Many of you, have heard stories. There are the Bible stories, the mission history stories like Hudson Taylor, and also missionary stories. But just listening to the story is not enough. You must make it your story. How can we help the current generation to make it their story, to journey with them, that that they are involved as well, to make it our story and not just history story. And so today I want to end with this prayer. And my prayer is that may the Lord raise up a new generation willing to take risks for God, serving God's purpose as we face the task unfinished. And I pray there are people sitting here, young and old, particularly those who may be older, that you will journey with the next generation. Journey with us, journey with them, that they themselves will also serve God's purpose. And I'm sure that in this generation, there are people whom God will raise up to be similar to Hudson Taylor. Yes, may not be intelligent, may not be physically strong, and yet there's one devoted purpose to serve God's purpose, and the gospel may reach the ends of the world. Thank you very much indeed.